Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, welcome. I'm Christine Cooper, the Saucy Seamstress, and today we are going to talk about the American War for Independence. We're going to do a little stitching, we're going to tell some stories, and so I'm going to try to mix in tips and tricks for making your 18th century gown, explaining what I'm doing, while telling you about women who actually lived through that period. This is not an exhaustive list. It is not a comprehensive list, and at best, the women that I'm going to talk about, it's really just a snapshot of their lives. But the internet is a vast place where you can find additional information as well as books at your local library. So I'm going to link some websites below and recommend some books if you are interested in this period in this place, specifically pertaining to women. So let's get started.
So first off, my apologies for my camera work here. It is not great. I'm trying to figure out how to set things up in this new sewing space. But I had cut out my pattern pieces out of linen, the brown linen that you can see here. It's pretty sturdy and can handle putting it together, making adjustments, taking it apart, and it will become my pattern pieces. And so that's what I'm doing here is now I'm cutting out my linen lining. I used white linen. Not as sturdy as I typically would use for a lining, but this is for a summer gown, and I'm trying to keep it as light as possible for upwards of 90 degrees. So that's the point, right? To make this piece, I took my measurements across my chest back, side back to where I wanted the robings to end, and used books like Patterns of Fashion and Costume Close-Up and things like that to kind of copy the shapes, only in my size. Now here I'm taking that pattern piece and I'm leaving about, I think, 5 or 6 inches at the edge there away, so those will become my robings. Once you attach the fashion fabric to your lining, you can then sort of build the robings. So once this is laid out and cut out properly with that whole big section with a straight of grain, I get the lining fabric and we start assembling those two pieces together. And before we join these two pieces of fabric, we're going to finish the center front and part of the bottom of both the fashion fabric and the lining. You can also see how I basted the arm side and the side seam. Next, we fold down the robings. I did have to cut a big chunk out of the top there because otherwise it would make it too bulky. I also had to add a little bit. You can kind of see the seam on the edge there because I wanted it to be long enough, and I always forget to add a little bit of length there. Then we stitch that to the lining. So I totally messed up the back. As you can see, I'd already sewn my two back pieces together. That's correct. I lined it up properly. That's correct. That line that I just drew, though, is wrong. I don't know why, but I drew it like 4 or 3 inches, I can't tell, from the lowest back point on the lining, and it should have been a few inches or less from that top hip point. And so then when I had cut this piece out, I had to go in and piece in some panels to make the skirt actually reach the bodice. So that cost me quite a bit of time, and I had to do pattern matching and the whole thing. Anyway, people make mistakes. That's life. Here you go. So now seems like a good time for a story while I start to pin in all of those beautiful 18th century back pleats. This particular topic is inspired by my work in a museum. I'm sure if you're a reenactor, a living historian, etc., and just so happen to be a female identifying or presenting person, someone at some time has made an inappropriate comment about prostitution. Like that is the only thing that we can think of when we talk about women's contribution to the American Revolution is camp followers who had to practice the oldest occupation for survival, and that's just not true. Countless women took on additional responsibility to manage farms, businesses, and families when husbands and sons went off to war. Women were responsible for household farm management, feeding their families, keeping them clothed and warm and safe. Many of all classes refused to purchase imported goods and instead opted for domestically made items, which at times may not have been fashionable or of very good quality. But what it did was force merchants to reevaluate their priorities. If you want to make money, you can't be importing goods that nobody wants to buy. Some women, because of labor shortages, weren't able to successfully run businesses and farms. And so they'd have to sell off these assets and properties and move in with relatives to survive. And this is a big deal because property is the whole point of the colonies, the new world, if you will. I understand it was not new and it was home to millions of people before Europeans arrived. Other women chose to shift the focus of the businesses, sell to the army, either officially or unofficially, as settlers and merchants who traveled with the army or just locally. Women provided much needed goods to soldiers in camp, things like candles, food, salt, and medicinal herbs. They also maintained family and domesticity by traveling and being near their husbands and brothers and sons in the army. Laundresses, cooks, seamstresses, and nurses were necessary for the survival and comfort of the soldiers, not to mention the women who risked their personal safety to spy on the British, transport messages and information, and delay British troops and officers. So, first, let's talk about Molly Pitcher. I remember learning about Molly Pitcher in school, and I think that was the one female I remember learning about in school. Molly Pitcher's real name was Mary Ludwig Hayes, and Mary was born in 1754 in the Mid Atlantic region. Her parents were German immigrants. She married a barber named William Hayes. Hayes joined the Continental Army at the outset of the war and served with the 4th Pennsylvania. Mary was a camp follower and often served as a laundress and nurse, two of the least desirable professions. Hayes was at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, and it was a hot and humid day reaching 100 degrees. Mary rushed back and forth from a nearby spring into battle to carry water to the overheated soldiers. When her husband was wounded, she took his place at the cannon. Some accounts say that she herself was wounded at the battle. I'm not sure. Either way, she took up the responsibility of service to her country and may have received a partial pension, which I think is pretty boss. Okay, once the pleats are pinned down, and I tried to pattern match, as you can see there, trying to be all fancy. I'm going to trim the edges and turn under the seam allowance, turn it inside on both the fashion fabric and the lining, and I prick stitch the back to the front, and then I basted on the sides. See there, where the seam allowance is in between the fashion fabric and the lining. In the same way that I turned that seam allowance under on the back piece, I did on the side seam allowance of the front piece. And then here I'm going to use the stitch with no name to join those two pieces together. I found that this is the fastest hand method for joining lining and fashion fabric together. This is also an easy seam to rip, so that if you do need to make adjustments, you can, but it's still strong enough to hold the garment together. So once the front is joined to the back, we then work on to pleating the skirt. Now I'm using the stripes as a guide. I almost never measure. I just usually eyeball it. You know, when it looks right, it's right. After that, I'm going to baste these pleats down with 2 rows of basting stitches. And you can see where I had to put in my little panels of I done messed up. But anyway, let's talk about Elizabeth Martin. She and her 9 children lived in South Carolina, and at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, 7 of her sons entered military service. While her sons were off fighting, Elizabeth and 2 of her daughters-in-law, Grace and Rachel, opened their home to wounded Patriot soldiers, often though they were forced to provide room and board for British officers. Not wanting to waste an opportunity, the women would delay the officers and steal their papers. From rifling, they learned that a British courier would pass through the area, so Grace and Rachel dressed themselves in their husbands' Continental Army uniforms, shouldered arms, and camped at the crossroad they knew the courier would pass. In this disguise, they ambushed the courier and his guards and forced a surrender. They took possession of the courier's documents and then released the men. They then sent the documents on to General Nathaniel Greene. While Grace and Rachel were out, Elizabeth stayed home. The men in question later arrived at her home seeking hospitality. They spent the night and were off the next morning, never suspecting that one, they had really been attacked by two women, and two, they were spending the night in the home of those women. Good job, ladies. Now I'm working on the petticoat. So to attach the waistband, I'm just going to very neatly backstitch right at the edge of the cotton tape where it will be less noticeable. It will also go under the bodice, so I guess it doesn't really matter that much. But here we are. Next, we're going to fold that tape in half, and I'm just going to actually whip stitch um, that down. And once that's done, we do the same thing to the back, and it's assembled. Next is just hemming. The next thing we have to put together is the stomacher. I've already cut the size that I want to fill the space between the robings in the length that I want to look nice. So what I'm going to do is insert some boning. I'm drawing the channels here so that you can see where they're going to go so that the stomacher will hold its shape, not fold up. It's one layer of fashion fabric, 2 layers of linen, and so the boning will be inserted in between the linen. What I'm going to use is reed.
So Phyllis Wheatley was trafficked from Senegal, Gambia, West Africa in 1761 at about the age of 7. She was small and thin, and therefore, instead of being taken to the Caribbean or the West Indies to work, she was taken to Boston, where she was sold by the captain for a low price to the Wheatleys, the Wheatley family. They were looking for a domestic servant. Now, the Wheatleys took her home. She did work as a domestic in their household, but they also realized that, she was a very intelligent girl, and she learned to read and write there. I mean, Phyllis was so smart, and had such a drive to learn. She learned from all sorts of texts on many different topics, including astronomy, geography, history, literature. She just consumed information. By the time she was 18, she had written about 28 poems that she wanted to publish in a book, and she was trying to do this sort of by subscription, kind of a crowdsourcing GoFundMe situation. But colonists weren't really interested in supporting the aspirations of a woman of color. So, abolitionist Selma Hastings, who was the Countess of Huntington, made sure that Phyllis's book was published. It was a book of poems titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. It was the first book of poetry published by an African American woman, and I think an African American at all. Now, this book of poetry opened with a foreword by John Hancock and was signed by 18 other notable Bostonians. Now, this may seem like a really great endorsement, right? But what the foreword was a testimonial by these men that they had set Phyllis an examination, that they had tested her knowledge and ability to prove that she was the one that had actually written the poems, because I'm not sure that they believed, and I am sure that there were a lot of other white colonists who thought that Phyllis's genius must be faked because of the color of her skin. The book also featured an illustration of Phyllis herself in the front plate, which shows a very, very lovely young girl. But really, all of this was to prove that Phyllis herself had indeed written the poems, that the work was her own. And the inscription reads, "We whose names are underwritten do assure the world that these poems were written by Phyllis, a Negro girl who was but a few years since brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa." I have some opinions about who the uncultivated barbarians were, but we'll save that for another time. Phyllis was a prodigy and an artist. She used her poems to criticize the institution of slavery and to promote other causes that she thought were worthwhile. She wrote, "Wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung. Whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. Such my case, and can I then but pray that others may never feel tyrannic sway." She won over fans like Ben Franklin and George Washington, and she wrote words that inspired people and made them feel something, even if they didn't let those feelings influence policy or change. So, in 1774, she was manumitted by the Wheatleys, and in 1778, she married John Peters. In 1779, she tried to again publish another collection of poems. She ran into the same issue that she had before, not being able to get enough subscribers and supporters to make this book a reality. He died in 1784 at the age of 31.
Phyllis Wheatley is one of those figures from history that I wish that I could know and not just know about. Now, as we move on to the stomacher, these are the tools that I use. Reed boning. I reed cane for boning. I use a pair of heavy-duty Fisker scissors to cut, and then I use an emery board to round the edges. To get the boning down into the channels deep enough, sometimes I use a pair of tweezers to help me stabilize the boning so it doesn't crack, but to move it down through the channels a little bit better. And because the reed comes rolled, it does have a curve to it when I put it in the channels. So I will use my iron with heat and steam to flatten that out and make it nice and flat and straight. To finish off the stomacher, we fold under and press both the lining and the fashion fabric, pin that in place, and then it's just stitched all the way around. I don't add tabs because I don't use them. And now for our last story about Deborah Sampson and to hem our gown and our skirt.
So Deborah Sampson was born in 1760 in Massachusetts. Lots of women from the New England area. She was one of 7 children. By the time she was 10, the family had fallen on hard times, and so Deborah was indentured to one Benjamin Thomas. At the age of 18, her indenture had been fulfilled, and Deborah, who was self-taught, worked then as a weaver, as a school teacher, but in 1782, she disguised herself as a man called Robert Shirtliff and joined the Continental Army. Now, during her time in the Army, even though it is post-Yorktown, she's still participating in a lot of daring do. In fact, she was shot in the leg. She was wounded by a saber on her forehead, and because she didn't want to risk discovery, she didn't ask for any help. She wanted to avoid detection, so she removed the bullet herself. No ma'am, not me. While she was recovering from, her gunshot wound, she fell ill. She was taken to the hospital where she eventually lost consciousness, and that's where it was discovered that she was a woman. Now, I am referring to her as she and as a woman because after this, she did choose to live her life as a woman. There is no real evidence to say that she was transgender, so I don't know. Maybe it would be better to call Deborah they. But Deborah was honorably discharged from the Army in 1783 and received a full pension from the state of Massachusetts.
Final thoughts. It's nice and cool. It fits very well. I only wish my fences were higher. But that's it for today. Thanks for joining me and have a great week.
Probably shouldn't just take cookies.
Man, these plums are good. Anyway.